Fantastic. Thank you, Jess. I'm looking forward to seeing what happens as well, Andy. I think probably most people would be familiar with myself and mindfulness. Director of Education here at the Monash Centre for Consciousness and Contemplative Studies. Worked in the medical faculty for a long time. Strong interest personally and professionally in mindfulness. But Andy, what about just saying a little bit about yourself and how you come to be here? You're interested in critical thinking.
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Thanks, Craig. Thanks, Jess, for the invite to participate today. I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher in the philosophy department, actually in Taiwan, at the National University of Taiwan at the moment. Um, but I am still affiliated with N3CS. I did my PhD here with Jakob Hovey, who's the center director, as we all know, or co-director, and another philosopher here at Monash, Tim Bain. Um, how did I get into critical thinking? Well, it's kind of an interesting story in some ways. It began through the PhD program. I was given the opportunity to teach some courses at Monash, and stumbled into the critical thinking course that we have set up here at Monash, and found it to be just profoundly useful for myself. Going through this material again, stuff I'd kind of thought about and knew about a little bit, but being forced to teach it really forced me to engage with it at a much deeper level. And I'm actually back in the classroom this semester, which is really, really nice. The last 2 years or so, I've been out of the classroom doing mostly research. But it's really nice to be back in the classroom, and we're at that really great stage in the semester now where students are starting to realize just how useful critical thinking is. So I had some comments from the students yesterday. They're like, "Wow, like I'd kind of heard that this was going to be fun and potentially useful, but I didn't realize how much easier it would make all the other courses that I'm taking at university." So that's it's always nice when you get that from the students.
Yeah. And we're going to be exploring a bit about critical thinking and then exploring how mindfulness can help with critical thinking, if indeed it does. But we kind of would normally think of mindfulness and critical thinking as being, I don't know, sort of the antithesis of each other. Like stop thinking, mindfulness and whatever. You could sort of stereotype it in that way, and critical thinking, analyzing things and splitting, all those sorts of things we could think about that. They, on one level, don't seem to go together. So hopefully by the end of this conversation, we'll get a sense that maybe they do uh,
Hmm.
support each other. So before we go any further, I mean, we use the term, everybody's familiar with the term critical thinking, but what is it? Is it just about being critical and criticizing what everybody thinks, or is it something different?
It's definitely something different. I quite like the way that we've led into this. It's this idea of critical thinking being inherently critical. This is one of the instances where we're using words in critical thinking that maybe we shouldn't be, because critical thinking is not inherently critical, or it doesn't need to be. Some ways that's misleading. The way I like to think about it is that critical thinking is a set of tools that we can use for a particular kind of reasoning. Now, in order to sort of understand this, we need to step back a little bit. Very roughly, we engage with information in two different ways. On one hand, we can have sort of instinctive responses to the information that we get, and we can make decisions based on gut reactions. That's sort of this system one, if people are familiar with Dan Kahneman's work. And then on the other hand, we have this more sort of reflective, slower, deliberate engagement with information where we take our time to reason through things. Actually, I saw a meme on the internet the other day that really drove this home for me. It was quite nice. It was a dog in the back seat of its owner's car that had jumped out of the window of this one car through the window of the next car over's window in order to get to the KFC that was on the back seat. There's this like clear case of this instinctive reaction. This first frame of this meme was this dog jumping through the window. The second frame was the dog after it's jumped through the window, looking back, going, "Oh, hang on, what do I do now?" So it had this instinctive reaction. "Oh, I want that KFC." Acted on it, and then only later realized that maybe that wasn't a great decision. So it's one of the things that we humans are able to do is to sort of step back and reflect. Hold on a second. What would be the consequences of acting on this intuition that I initially have? And critical thinking, as I think about it, is really a set of tools for doing that reflective decision making, reflective reasoning really effectively. It's things like understanding basic logic and how logical argument works, understanding how causal reasoning works, statistical inference, and understanding how to think about evidence and how to evaluate the strength of evidence. Now there's sorry, go on, Craig.
Is it a kind of a, it seems like you're describing a cluster of particular aspects which come under an umbrella of critical thinking. You could be using a whole bunch of different tools and put it all together and you say, well, that's critical thinking.
That's how I would think about it. It's a toolkit. It's the way that I would think about it. In that toolkit, you've got ideas about how to evaluate evidence. You've got ideas about how to interpret causal reasoning, how to think about causation, and you've got ideas about how to think about logical inference and these sorts of things.
Now, the big question is, were the two cars moving at the time the dog jumped through the windows, or were they stationary?
It was a static meme, unfortunately. It was just images, so
All right.
it's hard to
Okay.
say. I'm going to say they were probably stopped at the light. I hope they were stopped at the light.
Yeah. So that's system one, this sort of reflexive thinking. Uh, like sort of this intuition gets a pretty bad rap.
Yeah, yeah.
And Einstein, I think one quote he's given, and again, you always got to question quotes about Einstein: "Intuition's a sacred gift,
Mm.
rationality its faithful servant." Is this some sort of system one kind of thinking that people describe just intuitive, automatic, unconscious, or is it a bad thing, or has it got particular uses?
I think it's got loads of uses. There's certain situations where we need to rely on our intuition, our gut reactions, because if we do anything else, our responses will just be too slow. Right? So if you're trying to decide whether or not the car that's sort of swerving into your lane is going to crash into you and whether you need to brake, if you sit down and do the calculations for that, it's clearly going to be too late. You need to rely on your sort of fast, reflexive decision making in certain cases. The trick is to know when to do that, right? So for someone like Garry Kasparov, right, his intuitions about chess moves, he's a grand chess master, are going to be pretty good, and he'll be able to rely on them. For me, not so much, right? My intuitions about chess moves are going to be a bit of a mess. And one of the things that I think is kind of interesting when we start working on and learning about critical thinking is we realize actually our intuitions about reason and rationality are not as sharp as we often think they are, particularly where causation is concerned. So I'll just give you an example from my own case here. It was a few years ago. I was living in South Korea. Some friends of mine had gone out for dinner, and we had this doenjang jjigae, which is a big stew, soybean-based stew, and like many Korean dishes, it's sort of a big communal pot that everyone shares. We all eat from the same pot. I went home a few hours later, started feeling a bit queasy, and you see where this is going. I had a savage bout of food poisoning. After that, I couldn't look at doenjang jjigae for months. I was like, no, no, no. The jjigae made me sick. I don't want to have that. So this classic case of what's called post hoc reasoning, where I noticed one thing happened, and I noticed another thing happened. I ate the jjigae, and then I got sick, and then I inferred that the jjigae must have made me sick. Now, looking back at it, that's almost certainly not the case. Why? Well, because like me and my friends had all eaten from the same pot. And if they had eaten from the same pot, they would have got sick too, but they didn't. Right. So I can give you a little argument for why my causal inference was wrong. It's like if it was the jjigae that made me sick, then my friends would have got sick as well. My friends didn't get sick, therefore it probably wasn't the jjigae. Right. So this is sort of one case I think where critical thinking can be really useful as this sort of tool for helping us think through and think more carefully about the ways in which our intuitions might lead us astray in certain cases.
Right. And so really, that kind of unhelpful intuition seems to be a pretty unconscious kind of bunch of assumptions, misperceptions, and so on that we often project onto situations or people. Mm.
Yeah, I think the system one stuff can be, but I think it can also creep into our more reflective decision making as well, which we can
Mm.
make. We can make lots of reasoning errors when we're engaging in this slower, more reflective decision making. So not only are sometimes, so as you said earlier, that intuition often gets a bad rap and reasoning gets a good rap. And you're right that, well, in some cases, intuition is actually really useful and really quite reliable. But it's also true that in some cases, reasoning, if we're not very careful about it, can lead us in the wrong direction too.
Yeah. Now people talk about, using critical thinking to engage in and oftentimes win arguments.
Mm.
Arguments, we think we're using logic, etc., but they almost become like a form of combat
Yeah.
and using all of my skills and tools to slay the opponent and win the day. What is the argument at its best from a critical thinking, logical argument point of view?
Yeah, and I really like this. So this is another case where the words that we use in critical thinking are actually maybe a little misleading in some ways. Like critical thinking, oh, it's not inherently critical. And arguments in the critical thinking sense aren't actually about fights. They're not about getting into verbal disputes and trying to win battles. Right? An argument in the critical thinking sense is just a set of reasons for some conclusion. So I gave you one just before this about the conclusion that the jjigae was not what made me sick. If it had been the jjigae, then my friends would have made me sick, would have got sick too. My friends didn't get sick, therefore it probably wasn't the jjigae. It's a simple argument. It's premise one, premise two, conclusion. These can seem kind of trivial in some cases, but they can also sort of reveal some interesting things about interesting implications of some beliefs that we have that are sometimes like really quite or seem quite benign, right? So there's one that I like to bring up sometimes in classes. So here's a belief that you probably subscribe to some extent, Craig, and maybe our listeners do too, that we should be allowed to sell things that we own. If you own something, you should be allowed to sell it. It would be a pretty draconian government that sort of went, no, 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 you're not allowed to sell that thing that you own. Here's another belief you probably have. You own your kidney, right? So it seems to follow from these two beliefs that we should be allowed to sell our kidneys. Now, that might seem sort of okay initially until you reflect on, well, who's going to be inclined to sell their kidneys? It's not going to be the rich people with lots of money. It's going to be the people who are really struggling the most. And in the worst kind of situation, we might imagine like debt collectors coming after you to hounding people to sell their kidneys in order to repay debts. So when we think about argument in this way, it can be really useful for revealing that, oh, maybe some of the things that we intuitively believe, maybe we need to sort of soften them a little bit. Maybe it's not the case that we should be allowed to sell all the things that we own. So the way that I like to think about that argument in this case is that it's not really a tool for engaging in combat. It's a tool for thinking. It's a tool for helping us think through how our beliefs hang together.
I think, way too much of the time, not just in our own life, but in the public discourse as well, that often it does seem like a form of combat,
Mm.
adversarial, and creates an enormous amount of conflict and makes it very much harder to sort through and work towards, well, what's the truth of the issue, or at least as close approximation as we can get to it. But we kind of think that, well, it should be easy, but it's maybe not so easy. Like, what are some of the reasons why critical thinking is hard?
Yeah. So, I mean, one of the reasons that I think critical thinking can be hard is that we just have an intuition that we already have these tools at our disposal already. We already know how causation works, how to think about causation, and how to think about statistical inference. Where in fact, I think when we get into the weeds, maybe there's a lot of details that we're not quite aware of. That's sort of the surface level issue. The deeper issue is, I think, the one that you're picking at here, is that we often use these tools not to try to follow the evidence to see where it leads, but to justify believing whatever it is that we already believe. And so I think the conspiracy theorists are a nice case point here. Right? So when we think of like people who believe that the Earth is flat, there's a temptation to think, oh, these people must just be silly, right? If only they learned a bit of critical thinking, then they'd realize that they're wrong, or that the Earth is not flat. But that's probably not quite right, right? Often, people who believe in conspiracies are actually quite prodigious reasoners, right? It takes quite a lot of reasoning skills to justify believing that the Earth is not flat, to explain away all of the evidence against that view. So often what's going on in these cases of conspiracy belief is that they're starting with their conclusion. You're starting with the thing that you want to believe, say the Earth is flat, or vaccines are risky or unnecessarily risky, or whatever it may be, and then using your reasoning tools to justify that belief rather than trying to follow the evidence.
I can think of one example. I mean, having a medical background, that there were years. I can remember when decades, in fact, until it was finally accepted in courts of law that smoking caused lung cancer.
Right.
And so there's all of this evidence, but to actually prove it without, and the critical thinking skills of tobacco companies were to find little holes in arguments to sort of, or there's doubt about that, or that's not proven, or you haven't shown the link from that to that. So there was one after another for decades until in the end, look, there's not really any argument. Being a pack a day smoker increases your risk of lung cancer 20-fold. It's like, and but it was like critical thinking skills were used in order to not get to something that was pretty obvious, really, when you think
Yeah.
about it. But it is harder than we think.
Yeah, I really like this example of the smoking industry sort of pushing back against the overwhelming scientific evidence and being surprisingly successful at it for a surprisingly long time.
Yeah.
So that's this like case where reasoning schools are being sort of explicitly, deliberately used in this combative way. I think things are even a little more complicated than this, though, right, Craig? As you well know, it's not only that we sometimes use these reasoning skills deliberately in this combative way, but it's also that we're often using them in a combative way without being aware that we're using these critical reasoning skills in this combative way. In some ways, I think this is really where mindfulness might be able to help out a lot, right? If we're often unaware that we're engaging in argumentative combat, learning to become more aware of how our mind works and what's going on, well, that might help, mightn't it?
Well, yes, I think that again, from a clinical point of view, one of the main reasons why doctors are interested in things like mindfulness is to help with a whole series of unconscious biases
Mm,
we have that can affect decision making, clinical decisions, clinical errors. And so bringing that level of awareness is a kind of a really useful tool. Again,
mm,
I suppose if we could use that term.
mm, mm.
So, mm,
So, Craig, could I ask you to say a little bit more about mindfulness and exactly how it might help here?
yeah. Um, well, in terms of, I mean, mindfulness is primarily about awareness, so cultivating awareness. And there are all sorts of things happening within us, uh, mentally,
Mm,
physically, happening around us in the environment, in our interactions with people that we're often not very aware of at all. So if you could think of mindfulness as like coming along and you get to the dimmer switch in a dark room and you start turning the sort of the dimmer switch around and bringing the lights up. So whatever was there before is still there, but all of a sudden you're kind of starting to see it arise out of the darkness, as it were. And so you can think of mindfulness as like turning the dimmer switch and increasing the light so we can see more of what's there. It's not just that. The other main principle, apart from attention, cultivating awareness, is also the attitude with which we are aware.
mm,
So our ability to be present to our own reactions, feelings, stresses, all the things that are a pretty common part of being a human being, but to notice them in a less reactive, judgmental kind of way. And those two basic things are really skills for life, but they have a lot of particular applications for critical thinking. So with, cultivating more awareness. And so, as a doctor, you can have a lot of young children brought in by parents in the middle of the, cold season, and one child, you could be seeing many children in the course of a day, and okay, low grade fever, etc. Another child's brought in, and in the back of the mind, it's another kid with a cold, and you go through the emotions. You're doing all the right clinical things, but is your attention, are you really listening to what's going on in the chest when you put the stethoscope on the chest? Are you really looking closely? Have you entertained any possibilities that this could be the 1 in 100 children who does not have a cold, but has actually got the early stages of maybe a nasty pneumonia or something even more dangerous? And so it's not like, if we're on automatic pilot, we're not really paying attention, then we're just going through the motions, but we're not really looking, we're not really listening. And those unconscious biases frame how we interpret everything that's going on in front of us.
Mm.
And if we're a little bit more mindful, child comes in, start of the consultation, this little thought just whispers in the back of the mind, oh, it's another kid with a cold. But you go, oh, you've got an opportunity to actually pick it up. Oh, I'm jumping to a conclusion before I've even assessed the situation. Don't take an assumption to be a fact. Put it to one side. Look at this child, its signs, on its merits, and make your appraisal based on that. Because otherwise, 1 in 100 times we're likely to make a mistake or not pick something up for another day or two, which could, make a major difference. These are real life examples, not just theoretical ones, that can have a massive effect. So it's not like do a bit of mindfulness, I won't have any unconscious biases anymore. Well, no, it's just that we're more likely to be able to see them and self-correct. So I suppose that's one example of how the awareness kind of comes into play.
Right. Okay. So this actually seems really, really nice. I'm getting a picture in my head now of where there might be three levels in which mindfulness might help, and we're kind of tapping into maybe the lowest level where mindfulness might help critical thinking in this case, and that's that it might help us actually be aware of the evidence that's before us. Right. So if we're sorry, go on.
Oh, and to see an assumption as just an assumption.
Right.
That ability to stand back from our thinking processes,
Mm.
to be observant of it is sometimes called metacognition.
Hmm.
We're able to stand beside or behind, and that gives us an opportunity to appraise it a little bit more objectively, rather than if we're kind of caught up in it, we just take whatever little thought bubble comes into the mind, just take it as a fact because it's in my mind, but
Mm.
and do it pretty unconsciously.
Hmm. And some of these unconscious biases, like the ones that you've just mentioned, are not the ones that I immediately think of, right? When I immediately think of unconscious biases, I'm thinking of things like what goes on Twitter or on Facebook when we have these Twitter threads that explode into argumentative combat, where people are unaware of the fact that they're reasoning in this deliberately combative way. The example that you've put forward has made me think of something even lower level than this, that's more like, oh, the background assumptions that we have about the way the world is can color and shape how we see it in such a way that it can lead us to sort of misperceive the world. We might perceive or see or hear the stethoscope, the sounds of the breathing from the child's chest as being just another instance of a cold, rather than hearing it objectively without being colored by these background assumptions.
That's right. I can remember, for example, like in a work situation, running a mindfulness program, and one of the participants in that program said he's starting to pick things up at work that he wasn't noticing before.
Mm.
And he gave an example of like an email came in, so as a client, an email, and he just sort of was partway through reading the email. This person's being difficult and being, and and read it as if it was an aggressive email, and but he said he had a mindful moment.
Mm.
That is, all of a sudden he observed his reactions. This person, me, and he said, just sit back a moment, take a deep breath. Now just read the email, but without attitude, without all of these assumptions about the person's emotional valence and everything else. So he said he just read it, but it just in a kind of a calmer, less reactive way. All of a sudden it occurred to him, no, I don't think this person's trying to be difficult or aggressive. I think what they just want is a little bit more information to inform their decision. And he just sort of wrote back, and rather than an angry email that he was about to type out, he just wrote back a kind of a more friendly email. Can I just point of clarification? You're wanting more information for this or that, and what can I provide for you? Yes, just said that information. And it was a very amicable exchange. But we can be so quick to project onto people, onto situations, especially it happens with emails and so on, much more than often in verbal conversation, that to make these kinds of assumptions. And then we take it to be true, even if it's
Mm.
not. And then the whole interaction goes from there. And it really requires at least one person, but hopefully two, to be able to pick themselves up in these situations, to then engage in a really informative exchange of information so
Mm.
that both of you are working on the same page, not in combat, but in trying to determine, what's the truth of this situation or what the situation needs. What are going to be the most helpful solutions?
I can certainly resonate with that sort of noticing my reactiveness to certain emails, or in the case that comes to mind is reviewer comments to papers from at journals, where the reviewers will write something back that when I initially read it, I think, hey, well, no, 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 this is my precious work that you're critiquing here. But then if I read it a week later, once I've calmed down a bit, surprisingly, it often does take a week for me to calm down a bit.
We'll see if
Um,
we can get that down to 4 or 5 days.
But then often there's, even if there is a bit of a tone to their language, which sometimes there can be, if I can step back from the tone and let that aside and look through that, there's usually something really useful and important underlying that. And I think that there's something really potentially quite nice here is that maybe it doesn't always require both parties to be sufficiently mindful in these cases. Because in one sense, we are reacting to the hostile tones that we see. If the information that's coming back to us, the email that gets sent back to us, is without any of that hostile tone, then chances are we're going to be less likely, less disposed to respond hostilely as well. So we might have this sort of virtuous feedback where being less reactive ourselves actually disposes other people, the people that we're working with, to be less reactive, which then in turn makes it easier for us to be less reactive.
Yeah, so these kind of mental filters, assumptions, sometimes taking
Mm.
the past, projecting it into the future. That was bad last time, it'll be terrible this time. The kinds of things you were describing before that really lead to,
Mm.
unhelpful judgments and decisions and assumptions. And again, mindfulness can help us to see it
Mhm.
a bit more. Doesn't mean it all goes away, but it just helps us to see it. And when there's a noticing of it, there's the opportunity for self-correction.
Mm.
But also in the process of having a dialogue, when a recent review, mindfulness, and all the data shows reduces impulsivity. But how does impulsivity play out in a conversation? If we're on automatic pilot and somebody says something and then there's an automatic reaction, oftentimes with a whole lot of emotional baggage behind it and a whole lot of assumptions about what that person thinks. And all of a sudden we're fighting with or trying to burn down a straw man or woman or
Yeah.
whatever in the conversation. And again, that impulsivity, like, and if we're in the moment, we might notice, wait a sec, that reaction or saying what we want to say, but saying it like that is going to escalate. The difficulties. It's going to escalate the sort of the conflict. We might recognize, no, something needs to be said. but we find it easier to stay on the point. That's one thing that a lot of people often say is, I find it easier to stay to the point, not go off with those tangents, not to
Mm.
blame a situation, but rather than actually to connect and work through that situation. So these kinds of things that can come with mindfulness are
Mhm.
very useful for facilitating the whole process, I think, of critical thinking.
So I guess I've got a question here for you, Craig. It sounds like, or at least what I'm hearing so far, is that one way in which mindfulness might be able to help us here is that it can help us become more aware and help us notice our biases when we're using our reasoning in a combative way,
Mm.
when we're having an emotional reaction to an idea. It can help us improve our metacognition. Can it also help us sort of de-escalate from
Mm.
those heightened emotional reactions? So, I mean, it's great to notice that I'm having an emotional reaction to, I don't know, the reviewer's comments or whatever.
Mm.
That allows me at least to be like, okay, I shouldn't respond now. I should wait a week or hopefully only 4 or 5 days in the future before I respond. Can mindfulness also help us de-escalate in the moment? So we can be like, okay, I've noticed this emotion, this emotion. How do I deal with it?
It certainly can help us to reset. The more heightened the emotions, the more attached we are to our point of view and invested in winning, and our ego gets very much wrapped up in that, then the harder that is. Like when in the Olympics when they're doing a dive and they you get the degree of difficulty before the diver comes up to do the dive. Well, the degree of difficulty when the emotions are heightened and the attachment's very strong to needing to win, etc., then the degree of difficulty goes up significantly. But yes, we can. And so sometimes we might find that, all of a sudden there's an awareness of taking an entrenched position. We might notice that there's an argument happening in the really unconstructive way. And we notice all of a sudden two people are talking and trying to escalate because two are talking but nobody's listening. And so to all of a sudden to be able to reset, recognize what's happening and to be reset and say, look, I'm sorry, look, I'm, taking a bit of an entrenched position. Look, before I even, go any further, I really don't think I really understand, your position, what your concerns are. So just putting all this stuff aside, I'd like to understand better, what your concern. So you can actually de-escalate yourself, but it has a surprising effect very often on the other person. And to make sure that we've listened, I think listening is one of the really key things that mindfulness
Mm.
can help with. They talk about in the research on mindfulness the default mode network, which is kind of like takes many different forms, but like the internal, voice chatting away. And and when we start to practice a little bit of mindfulness, we often notice or start to notice that when somebody's speaking, we're not actually listening to what they're saying. They're talking, but we're actually rehearsing what I'm going to say in my own head when they stop talking. And
Sorry, what was that? I wasn't paying attention. I was just rehearsing what I was going to say next.
that's right. It happens even if we kind of think we're mindful. I've noticed, even psychologists one time, she was saying when she started practicing mindfulness, she said, I've noticed I hardly ever listen to the answers to the questions I ask. She said she asked a question, and then while the patient or client is responding to the question, she was rehearsing the next two or three questions she was going to ask. She was rehearsing what she was going to say at the end of the consultation. She said she never realized she did that. So now she asks a question, she just stops and listens. And she says, I don't need to be two or three questions ahead because the next question asks itself directly from what the person said. She said, we get to the point so much more quickly and with so much less effort. So this sort of internal chatter, internal noise, which we are so used to, we don't even notice it. We have the opportunity to drop that and to really listen, to really hear somebody else's
Mm.
perspective. And that often opens up the gates to go two ways. And boy, this is needed in a bit of diplomacy around the world as well, but opens it two ways for then somebody to have been having shown respect, to show respect as well and to hear somebody else. And then then we start to see what the issues are, and then we start to see, well, is there a constructive way to deal with this and to deal with that, and have each other's concerns recognized.
Mhm. And I mean, I can certainly see how when you couple that skill with critical thinking skills, then yeah, that's a recipe for a lot of progress, and particularly in diplomacy, but in everyday decisions, in everyday group decision making that we're engaging with, having both of those skills on tap would be very, very useful.
Yeah.
But I guess there's a bit of a worry that someone might have here that if we're being open-minded, if suppose we're engaging in a group decision making with some people where the outcome is going to influence us quite strongly, and it's going to influence them, say, quite strongly as well. We could go into this with an open mind, mindfully, with our critical thinking skills, and work together to find the outcome that's the best for everyone. That maybe it requires some concessions on my part, maybe it requires some concessions on their part. There's a bit of a worry, though, that if we go in open-mindedly and they go in chomping at the bit, ready to fight, won't we lose out? Or isn't there a risk that we'll lose out? Is there some situation where maybe we should not be mindful and instead reason combatively?
Well, who knows? Maybe there are. It's an experiment we could do perhaps and see what works out best. But if we're being open-minded, if we're listening, if we're being accepting, etc., doesn't mean that all of a sudden we become totally, I don't know, non-discerning. Let's use a word like discernment. Discern the strength of an argument, the strength of the idea. And unless something more clearly has been put forward that makes more sense, that accords more with the evidence, etc., if that hasn't been presented to us, then we might remain open-minded, but it doesn't mean that we just accept whatever is being said or whatever's being put or go along with it. We might need to still, no, unless you can argue differently and or present an argument that's convincing. Yeah, we don't need to change our view. We go with the best that we have until something better is presented. And there are some, practice like mindfulness. When you look at people like Mahatma Gandhi and Nelson Mandela, he practiced a lot of contemplative practices in that cell of his over those 27 years. And thank heavens he did, because when he came out of that cell, he was an amazing force for good in the world and for justice for everyone. But these people had an enormous capacity to be open, to hear others, to be respectful, and so on, but incredibly resolute in their ability to stand for principle. So there's this sort of flexibility, but strength at the same time. And because I think they're really grounded in themselves first, not being driven so much by ego, but also just really able to be grounded in their principles. I suppose like a palm tree, a cyclone goes through, and all the palm trees tend to be still standing because they've got this ability to move and to be flexible. So there's this strength and flexibility in the one thing. And if we can aim at that, then I think we're a lot better to deal with the sort of the storms and the cyclones that can blow through.
Yeah. Okay. So it kind of sounds like mindfulness can help us be aware, notice what the evidence is, be open to the evidence. But being open to the evidence is not the same thing as acting on it in some way, right? It ensures that we actually have the information, all of the information there available to us, but ultimately the decisions end up relying on or coming back to us. We have control.
Excellent. Welcome back, Jess. Now, Andy, happy to take some questions.
Absolutely. Yeah.
You got anything for us, Jess?
Got a few. I'll get through as many as I can. We've got one from Kathy. Now, I don't know who to ask specifically. Maybe you'll both chime in. What specific mindfulness practices could I integrate into my daily routine to strengthen my critical thinking skills?
Ooh.
Right. Well, I think the bread and butter of the mindfulness meditation, when we sit down There's all sorts of thoughts, the distraction of the mind. We do become more aware, and also emotions, feelings, anger, frustration, residual stuff from the day. All of that stuff comes in during the practice itself. But we're learning to cultivate awareness and a kind of a little stepping back, a non-attachment to it. So that's the bread and butter. But the really important thing is that we join the dots and translate that into our day-to-day life. And maybe we can start to do that with a particular emphasis on how we interact with others. We might start to notice in those challenging conversations we have is to really be conscious to bring that awareness to bear in those interactions. And maybe the most difficult people in our lives are not the easiest ones to start with, but maybe we can just start with those little sort of interactions, but to have those interactions in a more mindful way, to remind ourselves that mindfulness is not just sitting on the chair. It's actually a state of mind for the whole of our day. And to learn to maybe just ride those impulses, reactions, etc., that often come into the midst of those interactions. Andy, would you like to perhaps add something else?
Yeah, I might just add in it's that the way I see it is that mindfulness is going to be one piece of the puzzle, right? I don't think we're going to learn logic through sitting down and practicing mindfulness, right? So we might still need to go do some critical thinking training to learn about how statistical inference works and causal reasoning works. But where mindfulness practice might really help is it's almost like the background default skill set that we need in order to deploy the critical thinking skills in an objective way. That's the way I would think about it.
Excellent. Yeah, excellent question.
It was really good. I'm going to segue because it's sort of linked because Andy's just touched on it. Are there any tools or habits either of you personally use to balance emotional awareness with logic?
Tools is a tricky one. There's
tricks.
Sorry?
Tricks.
Hacks.
Tips.
I think the one that I use the most is just I have a default. If I'm responding to something important, I have a default don't respond right away. Right? I will read whatever the information is, and then I'll have a reaction to it. I might write down what my reaction is, and then I'll step away and think about it for a while. And that just gives me a bit of space to come back to it, maybe with a less hot head.
Yeah,
that's one trick that I have.
I think having that internal pause button and recognizing when you need to use it is really, really helpful. One other thing too is that I tend to find that when decision making is working the best, then the emotion and the reasoning are actually pointing in the same direction. And it's not just any emotion. The right kinds of emotions that we want to foster and cultivate, but also the best use of the mind in terms of critical thinking. And if they're tugging in different directions, then that's a really good time to press that pause button and to just be curious to see, what's driving the emotions in one way or the thinking in one way. And we might see egos involved in some way. We might see a very strong attachment to being right or something. We might find all sorts of things there. But I think that coming back to that pause button is probably the most helpful starting point.
I might just add on a little bit there if I can, Jess. There's part of the reason why I hesitated at the idea of trick is that it sort of implies that there's this, a quick, easy, dirty solution to these sorts of issues. And that's probably not the case. It's a bit like, we've run this back a few times, Craig, this analogy with exercise or going to the gym, right? Or staying healthy, right? There's no trick to good health. It requires a lot of work and it's going to take time. You have to stick at it.
Bit of a muscle. Nothing comes quickly, does it? Fortunately. This one, I think this one's a little bit more of personal reflection, so feel free to answer either of you. This is from Rob. Is mindfulness and prayer considered the same thing? Or would you consider it the same thing?
Mindfulness and prayer, not necessarily. I wouldn't say they're the same thing. But if prayer is a very important part of our lives, then we could do it mindfully or unmindfully. I can remember a Muslim student when asked me, was having mindfulness as a part of the curriculum, and had a conversation outside of the tutorial, and he said, I'm not sure where it fits into my prayer, because my spiritual practice is my prayer, and I'm not sure where mindfulness fits in there. And I asked him the question, do you ever find that while you're praying, and your prayer is very important to you, obviously, yes. I said, and your prayers pretty well, do you find ever when you're praying, you find yourself thinking about lunch or thinking about an assignment you've got to have in or something else? And he said, yeah, it does happen, actually. I said, good. Well, would you like to pray with more awareness and with more intention? And so that when you're praying, you really got your attention where you would like it to be. He said, yeah, that would be great. I said, good. Well, maybe you'd like to practice some mindfulness so you could do that with more awareness and more intention. So maybe it could help to support that. So I think they're different things, but I think in some ways they could work very well together. Like anything in life that we could do with, that's important to us, that we want to do with more attention.
Great. I think we've only got 1 minute and these questions are going to take longer than that. So I'm sorry, I'm going to have to not, I might see if we can try and answer them and send them through offline for those of you that did ask, but thank you. I thought I'd quickly add, so next week we have Dr. Luke Smith, who'll be hosting an in-person session here at Clayton around mindfulness in the workplace. So this will be a practical session. So those of you that can make it, I've put the schedule in the chat if you want to book in for that. We're also hosting a run of Craig and Andy's course, Mindful Critical Thinking. That'll start in 2 weeks' time. So I've popped that in the chat as well, but I'll also include that in the recording that we send through. And I think that's it from us all here today. Thank you, Craig, and thank you, Andy, for your time and wisdom. And thank you, everyone, for taking the time to join us. And we'll see you all next time.
Thank you for organising it, Jess.
No problem. Take care.